Good morning.
I feel very honoured. You're wearing a blazer, I think, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. I'm old school, so normally you'd get me with a tie as well, but I thought it's Friday.
No,
Yeah, absolutely. Very
it's
old
this
school.
is this is your dress down Friday. Look.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I remember I was talking to somebody about Dress Down Friday actually the other day, but I remember when that first came in. We're both showing our age here, right? Because I remember when things like Dress Down Friday came in. I mean, I'm so old that I trained at EY, and I remember when they brought in that women could wear trousers. Like that's how
Right.
old I am. Like out to clients, yeah. So, but it's really good to have you join us, Mark. Good morning, Adrian. Adrian, you're always the first. Like I literally feel I need to send you some sort of prize. So good morning, Adrian. I'm looking at lovely bright blue skies. Mark, it looks as though you're in a library, but what's the weather like outside?
It's good. Yeah, I'm in Southeast
Mm,
London, so yeah,
nice.
it's sunny. Yes,
Yeah.
the library is my professional
Yeah.
backdrop. I mean, I've always worked in PR, and there's a line in
Yeah.
PR is that if you can't PR yourself, you can't do it for anyone. So my backdrop is a curated backdrop of all my of books. So partly to make
Is
me look
it
intellectual, partly there's music books to make me look a bit edgy, allegedly. And
nice?
then the top is it's more my kind of political book. So it looks as though I'm
Interesting.
in touch, intellectual, and a bit edgy at the same time. I
Do you know
will I
what?
will leave it to others to decide whether there's
Well,
any actual accuracy to that.
you know what? Maybe I need to do a LinkedIn live where I get people to go through their library, right? Because I'm a bit like you. I'm quite strategic, actually. I was even arranging these this morning. I was
Yeah.
like, these are the books I want people to see. Who have we got in the comments? Hardev, good morning. Good morning, Hardev. Hardev, I know you were speaking at the international something, the Institute of Facilities Management this week, and I really wanted to get to you, but my week was crazy busy. Good morning, Steve Whittle. How are you doing? And how is the weather? That's the question. How is weather? Good morning, Oprah. Good morning, Junior Beeman. Mark Junior affectionately calls me Oprah, which I will take every day of the week. Good morning, friends. And obviously, we've got a couple of network leads in. So Junior also is a network lead at NatWest, global multicultural lead. And obviously Hardev, I think he's still leading Mia's Men. Adrian, bright with a bit of grey, bright grey here in Cornwall. Good morning, Max Schwartz. Good morning from Munich in Germany. Good morning, Max. Please tell us how is the weather in Munich, Germany as well. So that's the check-in. You have to tell us how the weather is. It's a typical remote sort of virtual meeting icebreaker, I feel. Right, it kind of helps you connect with people. Mark, thank you very much for being with us this morning. I know you're super busy.
It's all right. I'm never too busy to talk to people like you, Shell.
Thank you so much, Mark. Honestly, my VA Celia even sent me a message yesterday. She was like, "Hope it goes really well with Mark tomorrow. I know he's been on your list for a long time." Right? So, yeah, absolutely. Hardev, I know Hardev was speaking about men's networks at the Workplace Facilities Management event at the NEC. Inspiring talk and so engaging. If anybody hasn't heard Hardev talk, for one, Hardev gave a talk last year at our ERG Leaders Summit. Incredibly powerful and so inspiring. So, really links into what we're going to be talking about today, because it really is part of what Hardev is about in terms of creating spaces for men to talk in organizations. So important. It's Harley weather, so I'm out of office this afternoon. Harley, as in Harley like motorbike weather. Yeah, I love that. Weather is amazing. A bit too dry lately. Okay. Yeah, I understand. I feel your pain, Max. Right. So I've got with me Mark Brooks, OBE. I notice you've dropped the OBE on your caption, but that's fine. Good morning, Sylvia Anna. Morning, Cheryl. I wanted to be the first, but Adrian or Aaron beat me. LinkedIn let me down. Sorry, Sylvia. Right, so I've got Mark with me. Mark, so the tradition here is that Claude writes your bio and you get to score it out of 10. So here we go. This is what Claude has written. My guest today is Mark Brooks OBE, chair of the Mankind Initiative, which supports male victims of domestic abuse and a leading force behind the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys. Mark has spent years advising government, contributing to public debate, and making the case that taking men and boys seriously is not a distraction from gender equality. It is part of it. Welcome, Mark.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Well, a nice intro.
You're welcome. How did Claude do? Marks out of 10 for Claude on Claude's introduction for you.
11.
That's the first 11 that we've ever had, so we'll take that. And we're going to start with, so I think, I can't remember the post for this. I think I maybe talked about the world's smallest violin that sometimes comes out when it comes to discussing the issues that affect men and boys. And for anybody that doesn't know, when I say the world's smallest violin, because I'm conscious it's maybe a very sort of like English or kind of like Western saying, but it basically means there's very little sympathy, right? So you get a little violin out to play for people talking about men's and boys' issues. So let's just start there. First of all, why do you think that there is this empathy gap? Why is it that everybody kind of like sits up and pays attention when it's a gender gap that adversely impacts women, but they don't do it for men and boys? What do you think is happening there, Mark?
Well, I think it's been a 40-year issue where, and I was thinking about this week a lot actually, is that if you go back 30, 40 years, you know, women had so many barriers, structural barriers in their lives. I mean, in effect, you know, women were meant to leave school, work for a few years, get married, have some children and stay at home, and then maybe go back and work in a shop or something in their late 40s. And so that was the life for women. And so you had big structural barriers like that, sexism, you had employment barriers, education barriers, you know, low expectations of women going to university or becoming skilled, etc. And so if you go back, we're talking about the 80s really, and therefore when the focus around equality rightly started to look at the equality barriers that women and girls face, there was in parallel an assumption that everything was all right in men and boys. They had all the power, they were all in work, they didn't have any problems. And so what's then happened is that all the focus went on the women and girls issues because they needed to be fixed and still do. So, you know, it's not finished. But all of the problems that men and boys were starting to actually have just went in under the radar. And if you think about the deindustrialization, especially in the north and other parts of the UK as well, you see family breakdown, you see increase in mental health issues, you're seeing girls overtake boys in the workplace, in education. And also, you know, women competing with men in the workplace, and a move from, if you like, men being seen as the breadwinner to now just being seen as a breadwinner. And in effect, we'd written and started to write a new script for women and girls, but we hadn't done one for men and boys, even though their world was changing. So there'll be all these issues were just going under the radar. And part of that also, there was a political call with a small p, and that basically said that all women and girls have problems and all men and boys are problems. And therefore, if men and boys did have problems, it was their fault because they ran everything. So, you know, it's hard luck, you know, sort yourself out. So anyway, that sounds all very highfalutin, but where we ended up getting to was this empathy gap where actually society, employers in some respects, I might come on to some of that, and others just just didn't care as much for men and boys as they did for women and girls. And part of that was because they didn't think men and boys had problems, even though the data research and everything was starting to show that there were problems. You only have to go to some places still on our coastal towns and some other towns to see that things haven't recovered since the early 80s.
Something that, I mean, you said lots of things in there that that we'll hopefully like get into a little bit more in the conversation. But one of the things that you said, and I had to smile because I recognized myself in it, like when you said it, and there's something about this assumption of well, you've created the problems, or rather almost like, you know, because there is that saying, right, it's a man's world, and so there is almost this perception of, you know, men are in charge of lots of things in society, right? Which that is true to an extent. So I think there's maybe, I wonder if some of the empathy gap comes almost from, well, you know, men, you're in charge of things, so fix it almost. Do you know what I mean? Like there's almost I wonder if there's a little bit of that. And I do, in terms of that empathy gap as well, when I think about, I remember a few years ago, there was a guy who was sort of like doing the rounds, a British politician who was basically saying that we needed, like, for example, a minister for men and boys. And he was getting completely slated, like in his own party, you know, like whichever sort of like, you know, TV programs he went on. And I couldn't quite get my head around the response. Do you know what I mean? So I almost think like the empathy gap, you and I, when we talked about this, there's definitely an empathy gap with women, like for sure. Right. And I see it in like a lot of my friends. And I've definitely, there are days when I'm like, you know, men, just go and sort yourselves out. Do you know what I mean? Like, but you know, it's also with men, isn't it? But I do wonder how much of it is around, is there a gap, this empathy gap, is there a gap between the men that are controlling, you know, society, if we put it like that, so the men at the, you know, that are controlling things, and the sorts of men that you talked about that have been impacted by, for example, deindustrialization, is there a gap there in terms of actually the men that are kind of pulling a lot of the strings at a societal level are disconnected from the men, you know, potentially like lower socioeconomic status that are actually being impacted?
Well, yes, and just on the Minister for Men and Boys, I was actually working with the MP on that campaign, so I was going around with him to the TV studios or Women's Hour. I mean, I could wax lyrical about that.
Yeah.
That you know, 2 weeks of preparation for that. So yeah, I was there in the trenches with him. But again, there's been this assumption and. In the men run everything. Well, many men do at the top.
Yeah.
But there's millions and millions of men at the bottom as well. So you might have men still running big corporations, but you still got men sleeping rough on the streets, and there's a complete disconnect. And so the men at the top don't have any camaraderie with the men at the bottom, so they don't. So the men at the top don't actually see men at the bottom as being anything to do with them, because they're only interested in power and money, and they're not bothered about who they exert that power or money over, whether it's a woman or a man. And again, I mean, you know, I've been in the political trenches with a small p, so it's not party political, on these issues where it says, well, you know, men run everything. Well, you've just stepped over some guy who's been sleeping rough on the streets of London for months. So how is that working? And also sometimes you can get into navel gazing discussions about patriarchy and toxic masculinity and all of these things, and I always think they're just a distraction. I mean, I think it's a way of people trying to turn people into either victors or victims,
Yeah.
and you just end up pitting individual people against each other, and it's just not helpful. So yeah, when I hear the words patriarchy and toxic masculinity, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
well, what does that mean in real life, and how does that help not only men but also the people around them? And I always think when I've heard some women, we talk about, some people, saying men are X, Y, and Z. I'm thinking, but you're talking about, your partner, potentially, your son, your dad's, your brother, your male work colleagues. We've got to get away from a society, and I think we are now, from this battle of the sexes, when actually the game is a battle for both sexes. And I think that's where we've got to continue to move on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And on that vein, let's move on. Let's talk about the gaps. So let's talk about these gaps where, where the gaps where men are, as you sort of say, falling behind. I love that phrase that you use, which is that men used to be the breadwinner, and then now moving to this role of potentially just being a breadwinner, right? And the impacts of deindustrialization. So just talk us through. I know some people that are listening to this will know the stats around, for example, the disparity in education and things like that. But just talk us through some of these big gaps. So the big gaps in terms of where outcomes for women and girls tend to be better than for boys and men, whether that's like health or education, etc. What are some of the gaps?
Yeah, and I'll posit some of them in terms of some of the professions as well. So what we're seeing, so this September, the September just gone, in the UK, 45,000 more teenage women went to university than teenage boys. So that's a huge number, and it's about 56% of university entrance women, 44% young men, and there's lots of different gaps on that in terms of ethnicity and also where people, in terms of geography as well. But that's a huge gap. And that gap has been there for at least a decade, and it's been growing, and now it's that every year. And obviously that then has an impact in the workplace, and potentially make an assumption that quite a lot of people on here are from professional backgrounds. So what we're then seeing is that in all of the major professions, we're seeing more young women enter those professions. So if you look at healthcare, 60% of GPs entry level are women. It's the same for law. It's the same for psychology. It's the same for it's the same across all the professions. We're even seeing it in accountancy. So accountancy is always seen, but that's 50-50 now.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing the outcome of that, and we're seeing more and more women go into financial services, etc. And still a majority male. But you're seeing the output of all of this. We're also seeing at the bottom end is that we're seeing far too many young men coming out of school not being able to read and write. There's a big literacy gap between young women and men, and obviously that impacts on their work. So we've got about 250,000 young men under 24 who are unemployed at the moment. But at the same time, we've still got big gaps in inverted commas masculine coded roles like trade, being tradesperson, construction, logistics, lorry driving, etc. But also a huge gap still in female coded work, and I don't like any of those codes. That's why we've got to move away. But we got huge gaps in nursing, healthcare, teaching, etc. So we've got a load of young men who we need in the workplace as a country and as employers, but they're not in the workplace. So there's that. And then at the other end of the scale, we've seen an increase in male suicide. So 3 in every 4 suicides are men. We lose 14 men a day to suicide. And obviously it's a huge impact on them, but also their family and their work colleagues. And, you know, some of the trends that we see on that is that men generally in blue collar work are 2 to 3 times more likely to die by suicide than men in white collar work. So we're seeing those big changes in the workplace. And the last one is that the gender pay gap is reversed in terms of how we used to view it. So for young men under 24, 25, they earn less on average than young women. The gender pay gap then starts to go the other way, but a lot of that's driven by the motherhood penalty. Does that help as an overview? So there's still big challenges for women, but there's big challenges at both ends of the spectrum, age spectrum for men.
And I mean, interestingly, so some people will have been aware of some of those gaps and some people won't. So the gap around, for example, university entrance is something that, to be honest, I think I only maybe heard of that actually probably when I read Richard Reeves' book. That's when I was aware of like that as a gap. That's why it became like one of my most recommended books that year when I read it. I was like, everybody has to read this. The gap in terms of like, you know, male suicide, I think everybody is aware of that as a statistic. I guess one question that I've just got potentially as a follow-up actually, and I'm just going to dive into the comments, and if anybody's got any questions, please do drop them in. But one of the gaps, the male suicide gap, for example, and I know we talked about differences in occupation and ethnicity. What way is that gap going? Is it improving or is it worsening?
It's worsening. So
right.
So I mean, I've just written a chapter for a book actually that took me about like 40 hours to write, and lack of sleep. I nearly took up smoking again. Just get it done. It's like one of those old 1960s detectives. I was like that. Anyway, thinking I've got a deadline like a journalist.
Mark, this could have been such a different live conversation. You know, between your music books and your, So we'll do that next time.
But what's happening is that men's physical health is improving, especially around heart disease, cancer rates are dropping, not as fast as they could be. So, but the men's physical health is improving bit by bit, but men's mental health is actually getting worse. And so those suicide figures, so they're 14 a day. About 5 years ago, it was 13 a day.
Right.
Still too high. Going up. Obesity, which is more, it's an expression of physical health problems, but actually most of it's driven by mental health. Malobesity's going up, for example. More men dying because of alcohol related drugs, etc. So a lot of the mental health is going in the wrong way. The physical health is going in the right way.
That's really interesting. If anybody's got a question for Mark, please do drop it into the comments. I'm going to dive in quickly, and then we're going to and then we'll go on to the next one. So Sylvia's put here, men are also a victim of a white male patriarchal and hierarchical system. And then Steve, by framing this as a gendered issue, we distract from the real human problem at its core. I think that links as well, Steve, to what Mark was saying about it shouldn't be the battle of the sexes, right? I think we sometimes do get, and I think the media actually likes to pit it like that. You know, it's the battle of the sexes. You know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or whichever. Sylvia's got a question here. If possible, I'm interested to hear how looking at the gap for men does not take away from women. How does the concept of equality and equity fit into this conversation? So just your thoughts on that. I think you maybe touched on that at the top, but
Yeah, good. And also just on Steve's comment as well, is that you can end up in a position where even when I'm talking or others, you think, oh, we're we're saying it's men this, women that, etc. So a lot of the issues are that there's so much commonality in the problems that men and women face. But a lot of our work is then looking at the nuances which affect men because they're men and affect women because they're women. So the individual still has to be at the core, but their protected characteristics will add a nuance, and I nuance to that. And, you know, I always think of like women and men as kind of Rubik's cubes, which is like that there's kind of all different aspects, you know, different protected characteristics, different things, including place and class as well, which we shouldn't forget about. And you know, one of my big criticisms of recent government announcements or points on government announcements around unemployment and employment is that they've just announced big employment programs, youth employment programs, but they're not looking at the gendered aspect. So whilst 80% should focus on everyone, there will be particularly work barriers that will affect young men, and particular work barriers that will affect young women. So you have to do a blend on them. On the issue about equality and equity, I think you've got to look at it, as I said, look at individuals first, but also, you know, we are moving away from the fact that from zero-sum thinking, that if you start to talk about the problems faces young men in general, that somehow you're taking away from issues that are still affecting women and young women. I think we've just got to be smarter about that and not have a competition. And the equity issue, well, I mean, a lot of the equity issue is around that there are equity issues that affect men, and there's equity issues that affect women. But you have to have equality as your starting point, because, and you know, I've said this before, and some people, you know, there was a big push, for example, to get more women on the boards of FTSE 100 companies, which is really important and completely should happen. Put that in place. But what was then happening was that we weren't looking at the broader issue about equity. And what I mean by that, so what was happening, we were getting Rodine, Oxbridge educated women going on to FTSE 100 boards, and they were being seen as being less privileged than a white or black working class kid from a Peckham council estate. Or boy, I mean, you know, so it was like, so you've got to be really careful on that in terms of you know, looking at people through one protected characteristic lens, because you get into those conversations and that becomes just difficult. So we got to look at individuals first.
That's such a good point, because I think I maybe read an article about it where it was almost basically saying that we've replaced, when it came to, for example, getting women on boards, and typically in these like non-exec roles and independent directors, this article was basically saying we've replaced the old boys network with the old girls network, as in, you know, as you say, Mark, it was, and actually there was a group of just, it actually was quite a small number of women were sitting on lots of boards, and they were all from a similar class, similar schools, etc. And that wasn't, you know, that was not equity, right? Just because it was like ticking the gender box. So, you know, you definitely have to look a bit further. Just a few of the points that are in here. Emotional regulation is socially gendered. There are expectations of how men should behave from their peers. I think you probably agree with that, Mark. And I think I think it's the same for women as well. How much empathy and appreciation does society have for the merits of men? Right, examples: construction of infrastructure such as streets, internet, houses, garbage men. All of these things are done mainly by men. Interesting point there, Max. And then Steve, my work is dedicated to reducing male suicide by addressing men's issues before they escalate to a crisis point. I often find myself needing to justify this male-specific focus as though it distracts from women's issues. However, when 75% of suicides come from just 49% of this population, this stark statistic demands positive action, not justification. You must hear that a lot, Mark. People that are like, I have to keep justifying why it's okay for me to focus on men's issues, right? You must hear that a lot.
Completely. I say it all the time. But where I think some have not got it right, and Steve has got it right. I mean, I've worked with Steve, so he's a great guy. But is that there can be an issue of what I call othering, and what I mean by othering is that, and I see this a lot in the DEI space or EDI space. I see it a lot. It's not as much as it used to be, where, and there's a lot around this kind of male allyship as well, which is obviously needed. But it's like, well, we're going to support you men in the workplace because it's really useful as a means of better helping women in the workplace. And we see that with some of the work in schools on young men and boys. It's like, we're going to come in and talk to you about equality, etc., because that's really important for you to support women and girls. I'm not saying that isn't, but men and boys are like, well, you're not really interested in me then my problems and my challenges. You're only interested in me as a tool to help other people. And that's why I think that a lot of men in the workplace, and I've worked in corporates, nearly all my career, don't see DEI as being supportive of them, because a lot of the way it's framed is that, well, men, you need to engage in this because you need to help women and girls. Rather than actually helping, focusing on your issues. And then, of course, a healthy outcome of that will be to continue to support women and girls. And so there's this othering issue, and men and boys see that a mile off. There's no one more cynical in this world than a teenage boy. And they see that and they say, well, you're not interested in me. But I think the DEI space is really now catching up. And, got Hardev, his great work at Mears, and obviously, spreading the gospel around the UK about the importance of male employer support. Some people like Steve working with employers all the time. So things are changing, but we need to still take care in how we frame it.
Yeah, absolutely. And let us dive into this thing about the framing, because I think especially about the teenage boys, because we've got to talk about the Manosphere, Louis Theroux, Malark, right? So it took me a long time to watch it, and obviously we talked about that. So we won't necessarily go into whether or not the documentary was good, right? Obviously Louis Theroux knows how to make a documentary. But documentaries like that Manosphere program, if anybody hasn't watched it, I'd encourage you to maybe take a bit of time to watch it. And then also Adolescence, which was the very kind of like global phenomenon that it was, that Netflix documentary. They make these conversations front and center, but as you say, they often they don't often. First of all, they don't really paint men in a very good light, and they're there to sort of like raise awareness, I'm sure. But there is something about, do they help or hinder? Do they help kind of like shift understanding? Are they just distorting it? Do they create more tension between the sexes? I can already see there's a little bit of aggro in the comments, so just keep it respectful, people. Do things like the Manosphere and Adolescence, do they help or hinder?
They do both, which sounds like a terrible politician wannabe answer. They do both. I mean, they help in actually raising the awareness of some of the issues that, say, teenage boys and young men are going through. Issues around isolation, for example, lacking sense of purpose, lacking education and drive. But they hinder because they paint a picture that it's all teenage boys. And the work that I've been doing with colleagues is that we think it's affecting about 20% of boys. So there is a sizable group of boys, but we don't know who those boys are. So we're seeing that in some of the data. So a good example is that about 15% of Andrew Tate and others are good, but actually 3 times as many young boys and young men think Lewis Hamilton or Harry Kane are far better role models. So, but the way when you see adolescents and Louis Theroux's documentary and others, you think it's all teenage boys. And so then all teenage boys think the world is talking about them, not talking with them, or everyone's preaching at teenage boys. What are you doing in your bedroom, for example? So it can actually further stigmatize and push boys away, and actually bring boys who are on the edge of getting into difficult conversations, watching toxic influences. It can push them towards it. Most teenage boys, who see this content, and it's the algorithms which are pushing the content to them. They're not necessarily looking for it. Think these toxic influencers are idiots. I'll come back to that. No more cynical. So they may see some of the content, but it doesn't mean they're believing it. But the problem is some are, and that's where we've got to get to. So those programs help by getting the issues of young men and boys on the table, but also they hinder by stigmatizing.
Okay. No, it's a really interesting one. I am a little bit of research, and I want to get into. I want to dive into this a little bit more because I was on the train last week. It was last Friday actually. I was coming down from Leeds, and there was a group. There was 3 teenage boys on the table opposite, and they must have been no more than 18 or 19 maybe, and they were drinking a few pints, and they were I could make a lot of judgments and try to assess what they were doing, where they were going, etc. But it looked as though they were maybe coming from something that was maybe like cadets training or something like that, way up north, going to the south of the country, right? But they were very, they were quite boisterous. It's 3 young guys, very boisterous, talking about going to one or 2 of them were talking about going to see their girlfriends, after being away. So you can imagine what the conversation was like. It was like locker room talk, right? But on a train, right? So it was just very interesting to listen to and observe, how they talked about their girlfriends, and it could have been very easy for me to slip into a very judgmental place of, oh my God, they just sound like they've just kind of consumed Andrew Tate and absorbed it all and they believe everything. But what was interesting is when I noticed how they interacted with the woman that was serving on the trolley, she was serving like refreshments, etc., and also a woman that was sat opposite me that started interacting with them. It was really interesting. They were actually really respectful, and I thought, this is interesting. It's not as binary as all young teenage boys are, they're Larry, they're drinking and said they're this, and Andrew Tate and tiki-toki, blah blah blah. It's just not as straightforward as that. So I wonder sometimes whether we see certain behaviors, which is probably just the norm and always has been the norm, right, with young boys and young men. Let's be honest. When I saw some of the stuff on Manosphere, I kind of thought, it just looks like a Friday night down my local town.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But we've kind of, I wonder sometimes whether these things sensationalize it and everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, and like, and I'm not excusing it, but I'm saying, young people, and I include girls in that. Has anybody ever watched Geordie Shore? Like, young people, this is how young people kind of are. This is part of growing up, no? Do you think there's a bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, a lot of that is just said locker room banter. And I mean, actually, I was on the train on the Elizabeth line coming back last night for middle-aged women, and the things they were saying were a bit locker roomish as well. And of course, you know, my ears were like radars. I was listening in. I was looking
like writing down.
I paying absolutely no attention to what was on my phone, just pretending I was watching. So, and the thing is, I mean, what you'll then find, right, is that those three guys are all talking all their locker room stuff. And then when they go and meet their girlfriends, they're completely putty in their hand. You know, it's like you can completely imagine it. And it, again, because again, what's the data come out in UK and elsewhere, is that teenage boys and young men's commitment to gender equality, respect for women, etc., is continuing to improve. So again, you've got this dichotomy about. Well, teenage boys are a problem. Well, some are, but some teenage boys have always been a problem. I mean,
exactly.
Isn't it? The dangers, though, the manosphere are far more acute for a number of reasons. I mean, because of the type of things which are happening. I mean, first of all, you know, gambling, pornography. Also things like crypto sextortion, which is becoming more and more of an issue. Looks maxing, which is body image. And what's been interesting in the body image conversation is that, you know, young women are still susceptible and being fed a narrative that you've got to be thinner, whereas for men, you've got to be bigger. And if you're not bigger, then girls won't like you, etc., etc. So this is like a new age of content that's being pushed at young men and boys. No age restrictions. And it's a business model. And this is the thing. They're being hammered by online business models. And we're seeing teenage male suicide start to creep up in the UK, and we need to look at the causes of that, because to try and unearth what is actually happening out there. So there are huge risks on the manosphere. It may not be behaviours that the young men then exhibit to others, but it may well be the behaviours that they end up exhibiting on themselves.
And also just to clarify my the locker room banter story, and I'm not saying that like the locker room banter and the culture that sits behind that there isn't anything that's potentially problematic. That's the whole nother LinkedIn live around the
well, but it is problematic. So I'm not defending the middle-aged women that I was listening into last night.
Well, do you know what? The one thing I will say about that is when I ran a program once, it was a transformation program, and I would sit with the team who were mainly like women of a similar age, right? So in our 40s, and we had a program analyst who was male, and sometimes one of the women who was online dating, right? So she was online dating. So she used to come back and regale her stories. It was just the entertainment for us, right? And I used to sometimes say, and this is terrible, I used to sometimes say to our program analyst, who was younger, married with a couple of kids, I used to say, close your ears, because I knew that the conversation was going to be, sort of like quite blue. But so I think there is something about these behaviors and sort of being problematic. So let's move on from that before we let's dig ourselves out of that hole and go on to the importance of men's spaces. So this is something that, and it links to all of this, kind of like links to this gap, this perception gap around what men do and don't need. But whenever I come across particularly men in organizations. In fact, there's an organization I was doing some work with recently who, when I asked them whether they had a men's network for colleagues, for employees, and they said that they had been asked by somebody in the organization, but they said we're asked by the wrong men, as in, like, they said it was coming from the wrong place. I think what they meant, I think, was that it was coming from like a sort of manosphere sort of energy. It was coming with that energy. That's what they felt, and so they batted it back. But I was sort of still challenging them to say, well, are there some other men that you can kind of like pull together? Because potentially there still is a need. It doesn't matter where the energy is coming from. And if that energy is out there, you still need to listen to it. So I see this time and time again, that in organizations, there is a lot of resistance around men's spaces, whether that's in organizations or outside. So we can get into things like, working men's clubs and things like that. Tell us why it is important to have spaces for men. Why men's spaces matter.
It's important because it gives a safe space, but actually been seeing a lot of challenge on the word safe space, a free space for men to actually talk about the problems that they face as men with a group of other trusted men in their organization who may also share their experiences, will show empathy, will provide potentially solutions and avenues, and to support, and also a camaraderie and confidence to help those men address the problems that they've got. And I think that male bonding together is just an underappreciated aspect of just how men work together to support themselves, but within that group. And also, again, the groups I've spoken to and said, Hardev and Steve are on here as well, is they're hugely respectful for the women in the workplace. So again, it's just having that space for men. And also what it shows, a bigger picture for employers as well, is that it shows that, especially if you're looking at health, well-being, safeguarding work, it shows that actually men have distinct issues and challenges themselves. And I'm always very taken on the importance of looking after. It comes back to that suicide statistic about men in blue collar roles, because my always challenge is that what's good for Andy in accounts is not always good for Dave on the drains, Ben on the bricks, or Lee on the lorries. And I think having men's support groups actually helps ensure that there's a whole company lens on looking after the men in the workplace and the different types of men. So they're really important, and we've seen a big increase from employers in supporting International Men's Day, Men's Health Week, mental health. And I've been in part of the International Men's Day work for 15 years in the UK. And 15 years ago, I mean, everyone, the one line we used to get, well, isn't every day International Men's Day, was one line. And then it was about only 10 organisations that did anything. And the group of us who were running International Men's Day, I think we ran about 8 of them. So, but now, I mean, but last year we had 800 organisations across the UK marking International Men's Day in one shape or form, and the majority of them were employers doing things for their male colleagues. But it's that sense of camaraderie, the sense of belonging, the sense of actually coming together as men to talk about the issues they face without. And I'm sure Hardev can add to that as well.
It's a really interesting one, I think, especially about International Men's Day, and it probably links a little bit as well, as you were saying, to like the D&I agenda, which is, at the end of the day, everybody's got to see benefit in it for them. It can't just be that there's one group that just is there to give to everybody else. I know, and I think part of the problem is that conceptually, even now, and I can see a little bit of it in the comments, I think conceptually, though, we've just been so conditioned to not see it in that way, to not see men and boys disadvantaged in the system, right? I think that's why we sort of like struggle. I'm gonna dive into the comments, and then I'm gonna maybe come on to, I think the point that is adjacent to this is men's spaces being associated with power, so being associated with hoarding power and why that sometimes gives men's spaces a bad name. Tayo, good morning. I'm going to read part of this comment off, but it's too long for for the tech on this side of LinkedIn. We need to work with, not do to. The news and drama depictions focus on telling the bad news stories. This gets amplified. The good news stories of empathetic, emotionally regulated maturity is not celebrated or amplified. People are full human beings that need to be viewed holistically. Manners, mutual respect, and spaces where people can have difficult conversations that do not polarize but are viewed as data. When we avoid confrontation, we create bigger problems. I can't read the rest of it, Tayo, but I think I know what you're getting at there. Thank you. And then Sylvia, the women generally is the first caregiver. Who will have a powerful influence on the boy attachment style. Oh gosh, we're getting into the role of mothers and boys. I don't know if we're going to have time for this one, Sylvia. And consequently on his ability to emotionally regulate as an adult. I know, Mark, when we were talking, you were talking about, I mean, Sylvia, you're going in deep here because you're talking about emotional dysregulation and the point of that. I think you're actually raising some really interesting topics here, Sylvia, because this is something we were talking about, weren't we, Mark, in terms of parenting styles and parenting being different for parenting being quite gendered, actually. Do you want to just talk us through that really quickly and how that maybe kind of like shows up later in life, even connected to things like the reading gap and the literacy gap? Do you want to just talk about that?
Yeah, so some of the research and data that's coming out is, and I really recommend a book called The Story of Dad by Dr. Anna Makin. It came out a couple of years ago about the different roles of mothers and fathers, and certainly she's an anthropologist from Oxford Uni. So, I mean, when she was saying that, you know, the mother's role is broadly, right? So about emotional,
generalizing,
emotional regulation, caregiving, nurturing, whereas the father's role is to prepare their children for the outside world, to manage risk, to manage their behavior out in the outside world, and what the kind of research is starting to show is that especially when boys go to school and girls go to school, there's a physical issue because boys are slightly and less developed than girls when they go to reception, to nursery 4 or 5, but also they know less words. They're not being read to as much, and because there's an assumption that they don't need that level of support that young girls need, when actually both need that level of support. And also sometimes in the school where boys got too much energy, they're expected to just sit still rather than actually given opportunities to burn that off, and then they will sit still. So I think in terms of that those early years, that really does have it's an issue for boys. And also, if there isn't a father figure, so I'm not talking about a father necessarily, it could be stepdad, be, you know, an uncle or whatever, an absence of father, you know, a male role model in early years of boys and young men is an issue, because they look to men in their lives to show them the way to be a man in the future. And if they're not there, then that risks their emotional development. Also can exacerbate risky behavior because they haven't got, if you like, guardrails, which a lot of father figures provide. Now, women do that as well, but boys do look to men for that more than a woman. And, you know, so there's risk when there's not enough men around. And that's why we talk about the need for more men to get into to run sports clubs, to actually get involved in running scouts, cubs, cadets, and also more male teachers, because young men and boys need to see more men in their lives. The old adage is that it takes a village to raise a man, but it's really helpful if some of those villages are men as well.
I like that. And And a really interesting point from you, Tayo. Really interesting. So this maybe was the end of your point earlier. Each gender needs venting space where individuals can address challenges. So this was to the point of the importance of spaces for men, etc. The other thing to consider is there are different cultural approaches to transitioning to adulthood and also parenting. So the conversation we've just talked through, we are discussing a Western or global North view here, absolutely. And I want to come to the whole gendered parenting thing. I mean, many years ago, there was an experiment of non-gendered parenting. I want to say that it was, I'm probably stereotyping, but I'm sure it was Scandinavian. It was either Scandinavian or Dutch, where there was a child where the school didn't know their gender. Do you remember this, Mark?
Yeah.
And the parents were deliberate in that, because I think you're right. I mean, even I've got friends who are like, oh, you know, boys and girls are definitely different. I've got one of each, and the boy is this and the girl is definitely that. And I think parents don't realize that, you know, we don't speak to, you know, boys, baby boys as much. You know, I don't think parents realize how much their parenting style then has on some of these things as well. So that's really interesting. Somebody says it's thanks for recommending it. The Life of Dad by Dr. Anna Machin. Is that
That's
the book
the one,
you
yeah,
mentioned? Yeah. Amazing. If you've got any final questions or comments, please do drop them in, because we're wrapping up now. And we're going on to the one thing, I guess, before we get onto that, is there any bits of new research, Mark, that you're working on that I haven't mentioned today that people should be aware of? And also, actually, if their organizations want to get involved in the research that you're involved in the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys as well. So what have you got? What's in the pipeline?
Well, there's a few things in the pipeline, but there's some that we're looking for company input. I mean, we're particularly looking at boys' education and skills at the moment, and we've got a few research projects on the attainment gap, which I alluded to. But one we're particularly looking at, and I referenced it, is we're looking at a List Boy Cares campaign, because we want to find out why so many boys are not having careers in health and education, HR, literacy type roles, because the gender stereotypes in careers, boys, if you like, are only being promoted masculine adjacent careers broadly, finance, or, as I said, were outside roles, construction, when there's huge gaps in teaching in social care and health. And so we'll be in the September, we'll be launching a List Boy Cares campaign, where we're going to look at research and campaigns on how we can persuade more young men and boys to go into those careers, and importantly, make sure that we're breaking down the stereotypes so they get from not only just parents, but also career services from schools. So yeah, List Boy Cares is a big campaign that we're looking at, because we've got far too many young men who are unemployed and far too many vacancies for entry-level jobs that they could do.
Yeah, absolutely. And this final question here actually kind of like links into what my last question was going to be, which is always around like, what's the one thing that organizations can do to better support their men in the workplace? We've got a question here, Mark. What do you see as the 2 to 3 biggest things we can do to face into this challenge and do something tangible to have an impact for men of today and the next generation? Great question.
Right. Well, on that, there's 2 to 3 things. First of all, positive narrative. So we need to talk up young men and boys. They're great men and boys. So we need to say, so they need to hear the message. We see them, we hear them, we believe in you, we're on your side. They need to hear that constantly. Secondly, we need to make sure they get better education, that they get skills, that they actually, and there's jobs as well. So jobs where they live. Don't want everybody trying to move to London, because that's where all the jobs are in the home counties and the other growing cities. And the third area is that we need full. So we need to invest and have better mental health services, for example, for men, for young men. We need to have better regulated social media to deal with those manosphere issues. And we need to get them offline and outside, not online and inside. We need to get them out. So that's 3 things. My last point on there's 2 things. I'm going to cheat. I'm a man. In terms of, like, you don't expect us to stick. I don't cheat because I'm a man. I mean, I cheat because I don't always stick to the rules. I said quickly without any break in breath. The issue is more employer support groups. I think every employer should have one for men. And then the second area, and I talked about the boys, look at how many entry-level roles you've got coming into your workplace and what the gender dimension is, because we've seen male apprenticeship numbers fall. We've seen entry-level numbers for men, young men into entry-level roles. My challenge for employers is actually, are you seeing this? And if you are, what are you going to do about it? Because we have to get more young men into the workplace.
Yeah, well said. Taya, I spotted your last point, so maybe I'll get Mark to answer this one question really quickly, because I think earlier in the comments, I think Taya was asking about the ethnicity split. No, actually, it was Sylvia was asking about the ethnicity split in the suicide stats, which I know is something that you've got, and I think it links your point, Taya, here around looking at things from a different lens. So, for example, like the Global South lens that potentially provide alternative solutions. And I totally agree with you on that, Taya, because it was one of the questions that I had, which was around, for example, the suicide stats, why there is a difference by ethnicity. So do you want to just talk us through that really quickly, Mark? And then we absolutely are finishing.
So there is emerging research. So it's not been looked at in as much detail, but it tends to be that more white men take their own life than white global north men do, because their community ties are actually looser than perhaps other communities in the global south. So them and more of a community feel. So what we're finding is that men in the from, say, Black and Asian communities in the global south and in the global north, the suicide rates are lower, and the feeling is because there's stronger community bonds in those communities than in white communities. Very general comment.
And emerging research, and I think your point, Tayo. I mean, I'm with you on this. Whenever I'm looking at these, anything to do with like human behavior, I'm always interested in, from like an anthropological perspective, actually, what does it look like in different cultures? Because I think there are always lots of learning in that. Mark, it's been amazing having you. Thank you so much. Where can people go to find out more about what you're doing and connect with you, and see how they can support the work, etc.? Where's the best place to find out more?
If you go on our website, which is menandboys.org.uk, and of course you can follow me and Research Centre on LinkedIn as well. So we're pretty active on LinkedIn, and just get in touch. So through the website or via LinkedIn.
Amazing. We're going to leave it there because we've gone over, which I thought we might do that. But thank you, everyone that's been with us in the conversation, and all of your sort of thoughts and questions for Mark. Mark, thank you. Thank you again so much. And for anybody that's watching on the replay as well, thank you for spending an hour and 3 minutes with us. Everybody, make sure you have a great weekend. Thanks again, Mark.
Brilliant. Real pleasure to be invited. Thank you.
You're welcome.